Hello, I'm Jenny Fern, and welcome to my library. I'm a chaotic neutral mechanical engineer who's really into permaculture and wants to talk about books. So let's talk about books. My bookshelf is looking a little weird right now because I had gone through and pulled every book that I read this year for my shelves to do my end of the year wrap up. Today, we are looking at this stack. Oh my god. Books are so slippery. Terrifying. So today we're talking about my favorite reads from 2024. These are books that I personally read this year, 2024. I am going to start with my favorite books, my top favorite books. So I am going to, I guess, do it the opposite of what people usually do. If you want to see my favorite book that I read this year, I'm going to tell you right at the beginning. Let's go for it. I read this book. It's recorded in a reading vlog. It is reading 5 books from authors that I had given 5 stars in the past. I was reading a book by Antoine de Saint-Exupéry because of this beautiful little book right here. That's The Little Prince. So I decided to read some of his other work. Even though he doesn't have anything that's exactly like The Little Prince. The Little Prince is like an illustrated children's book, and his other work seemed to be nonfiction, a lot about like flying. He was a pilot, and that was a really big part of his life, was flying. And I saw this, and I decided to pick this one up out of all of his work. Now I'm gonna have to look at his catalog and see what else is out there to explore. Oh, I was gonna light a candle. 1 second. I'm like really losing a lot of things today. Where did I put that gigantic box of matches? Inordinately huge. Oh, here it is. This is what I mean by inordinately huge. It's giant. Let's move on. My favorite book that I read this year is Wind, Sand, and Stars by Antoine de Saint-Exupéry. I love this book so much. Here you can see my dog earring at the bottom. I found so much beauty in this book, and I found so much to relate to in a weird way. But for other people, for not me, why should you read this? This was published in 1939. It is written by a French pilot, and a lot of it has to do with his experiences as a pilot and his experiences in life. And it goes through different locations. Like one of the chapters at the beginning has to do with this really scary experience where he's flying in Patagonia in Argentina. So there's battling of the world itself, the elements. There is a description of how people have a warped view of the world because we live and we travel in a small zone. Roads and paths are, and train tracks and such are where people live, and we live next to rivers, we live next to the coast, we live in these hospitable places. And so there's an exploration of like a lot of the world is inhospitable to us. There's a really beautiful section all about his experience crash landing in the Sahara, wandering around in the desert. They're dying of thirst, quite literally. And a lot of that is the inspiration for The Little Prince. So if you are a fan of The Little Prince, definitely read this book. I loved almost every minute of it. And I will say there was one section that I think I will need to reread to understand. There's a chapter where he talks about buying a slave to free in some way. And that was maybe the only section where I just wasn't fully there for what was happening on the page. and I left a little confused. Otherwise, this was a beautiful, beautiful work. So important to me, and just so much about life and humanity. I really recommend it, and this is a favorite of all time. I also really loved this book. I read this right at the beginning of the year. This is a perfect book for this time of year. That's The Gift of the Deer by Helen Hoover. It opens during Christmas, and it is about this woman and her husband. They live in the remote woods in winter. Life can be really harsh, but there is a deer that they see on Christmas Day that seems to be really struggling, and so they decide to help him out. And this follows a family of deer over a few years. This was just so impactful. This was so impactful for me. This is nonfiction. This is like a nature memoir. It really is about these deer and the relationship of these people with these deer. I just thought it was beautiful. So, again, an all-time favorite of mine. And this was published in 1968. My love for this book is slightly inexplicable because the other two, I feel like hands down, I think a lot of people, if they read those books, they would think that they were beautiful and lovely and important, and you could hold them in your heart, and they have very poignant messages about life. This, I was just down for the ride, and I think this is more of a me, my preferences, and the things that I really like to see in a book, and that's Dark Princess by W.E.B. Du Bois. And part of the reason why I know that not everybody is going to like this book is because I read the reviews that people have left, and they're not the most generous. So I can see that there would be some things to criticize about this book. I totally understand that, but for me, this was a wonderful surprise and such an enjoyable story to go through. This was first published in 1928. It's officially in the public domain now, so go ahead and read this at your leisure. Anybody in the United States. This is about a man and his life. His name is Matthew Towns, and he is a black man from America. He is studying to be a doctor. When we first meet him, he has been disallowed to continue in that field because he is not allowed to finish some critical elements of his education due to restrictions that white society has placed on black men. He is a bit disillusioned by that. He goes to Europe. There he meets this group of people. They are like a league of non-white people against colonization. One of the prime people of interest for him is Cotillia, who is an Indian princess, and he just falls in love with her. So this follows his life through a lot of events and his connection with this princess and with this league of people. I loved it. I just thought it was such a cool book, such a cool story. It just felt so unique and like a wonderful experience. I was so happy that this book had been written. So those are my top 3 books that I read this year. I'm going to go through more of the books that I own and have in my possession that I loved this year, and then I'll also go through the books that I don't have physical copies of as well. One of the books that I loved was The Garden Jungle by Dave Goulson. This is a book about wild gardening practices and insects and other wildlife that you could find in your garden. And this is so aligned with my interests in both insects and gardening. It's a wonderful nonfiction work, and I really recommend it. Just today I was cleaning out my little free library because I have had some insects go in and seek refuge in there, like a lot of ants that have used one of my books to lay a bunch of eggs in. Also some earwigs, which I found a new appreciation for earwigs with this book. So highly, highly, highly recommend this book. That's The Garden Jungle. I also read a stunning graphic novel. I have been fairly disappointed by many graphic novels. I'm actually reading one right now that I'm fairly disappointed in. But this surprised me in a really wonderful way, and I think it's one of the best graphic novels out there, probably. It's one of the best that I've ever read, and that's Snapdragon by Kat Leigh. This is about a young girl and her relationship with a few people. One is this old woman who both helps rehabilitate animals, both wild and tamed, and she also collects roadkill from the side of the road and reconstructs those animals into something that she sells, which is a little weird, but she really venerates the animal and the life that it had. So there's that whole aspect of it, which I'm completely on board for. And then there's a lot of really beautiful representation in this book. There is trans and gay representation, which I just thought was so beautifully and wonderfully and like genuinely done. It seemed really beautiful to me. This is just slam packed with so much content that all works well together. There's no wasted space or wasted time. Oh goody! I loved this book so much. This is almost inexplicable book, but it's The Factory by Hiroko Oyamada. This is a very short Japanese translated fiction about a factory. And the factory, you don't really know what they're doing. You're following 3 people who all have different roles in this factory, and from their perspective, you start to see some slightly surreal things. It's just so wonderfully like rooted in being a worker, and then also like fantastical that it almost makes it seem like even more relatable than real life, if that makes sense to people. I think if you work at a factory, if you work at a corporation, this might resonate with you. I loved it so much. This is Anne of Green Gables by L.M. Montgomery, and I just feel like I've already read this book. I feel like I don't need to tell everybody that I read this book this year because it seems like it's already been in my life. Like I feel like I've had this book in me this whole time. So it's a weird experience saying this is one of my favorite books that I read this year, because it's so strange to me that I read this book only this year, but it was beautiful. Anne Shirley is one of the most endearing characters I've ever met. She is an orphan girl. She gets adopted into this family by accident, and she just learns how to be a little person. She has so much spirit in her, and she's not always good, but she is so beautiful and so touching. I also can't believe I read this book this year. It also feels like I have had this book within me for a long time. That's Between the World and Me by Ta-Nehisi Coates. I remember my husband talking to me about Ta-Nehisi Coates some years ago, and at the time I just wasn't ready to read the material that my husband was talking to me about. It felt very painful. So I was finally at a point this year where I felt like I could read this work, and it was so beautiful. This is a lot about what it means to be a Black man in America and what it means to inhabit a Black body. It is written very poetically, very beautifully. Highly recommend this. This year has felt very long in terms of reading because I read this maybe in springtime. It was during my quantum mechanics era, and I was just thinking about the things that I was doing while I was reading this book, and it just feels like so long ago. But that is Reality is Not What It Seems, The Journey to Quantum Gravity by Carlo Rovelli. This is a non-fiction physics book about quantum mechanics, and it has a really wonderful background. The way this book is written is so comprehensible, and it just makes so much sense. It gets your mind going in a really beautiful way, and it doesn't make you feel dumb. It was a wonderful reading experience. I flew through 3 Carlo Rovelli books this year because my experience reading this book was so wonderful. So if you're looking for a physics read, a science read, I recommend Reality is Not What It Seems. Oh, I flew through this book as well. I think I read this in like 2 days. I loved this, and I would really like to continue with this series. That is Parable of the Sower by Octavia E. Butler. This is the first book I've ever read by Octavia E. Butler, and I'm so interested in her as an author. I love science fiction. I can't believe I haven't read from her before. This is a near future story. This was written in 1993, and it is set in 2026. Is so close to our real life. It was just stunning. It was such a good book, and I think particularly it's really good for what we have right now. At least that's how I felt when I read it. Yeah, there's a climate crisis. There are like factory towns with like rampant capitalism. The class divisions are at their worst. I just thought this was so good. This was a full surprise for me because I was doing my 1993 reading vlog where I read Parable of the Sower, but I picked out this book I'd never heard of before just because it was published in 1993, and when I read the description of what it was about, I was like, sounds like something I'd be interested in. That is The Geography of Nowhere by James Howard Kunstler. And the description: a wonderfully entertaining, useful, and provocative account of the ravaging of the American environment by the auto, suburban developers, purblind zoning, and corporate pirates. Such wonderful historical background for why America is shaped the way that it's shaped in terms of suburbs and towns and roads and infrastructure. The way that we live in this country is really explored through both historical context and our current policies and our current culture. This really spoke to me and a lot of the feelings that I've felt growing up and living in suburbs in the United States, and the strangeness of how our society has been structured in the physical world. Well worth reading, and I really recommend it as an excellent nonfiction if you're interested in reading about that sort of thing. I have a wonderful manga to share. I've only read 3 volumes, but it is so cool, and I did watch the full anime, so I know that the whole story is a very compelling, interesting story. And that is Pluto by Naoki Urasawa and Osamu Tezuka. This is based on Astro Boy. it features these really powerful robots after this huge robot war. And these robots are being killed off one by some immensely powerful force. And there are a series of seemingly connected human murders. This follows a detective who is also a robot and his experience trying to solve these murders alongside his robot compatriots. This is so freaking good. This was a book that I read at the beginning of the year that I just ate up and I took wholeheartedly. Just took it exactly as it was. Earthlings by Sayaka Murata. This book was like therapeutic, I think, for me specifically. I was so on board for our main character. We meet her. She's a little girl and she's weird and she does some really taboo things and she is horribly abused. Her family does not love her. She does not have people around her that she can trust. And then we see her as an adult and she has gone down a road. And I loved exploring that with her and the people that she had with her. So that's what I'll say about this. If you think you might be interested in a weird book about a weird girl who kind of goes off the rails in a pretty extreme way, and it gets more and more extreme as it goes along, this. For now, I'm gonna call it quits because I got to go to decorate a Christmas tree. So I just woke up from a nap on the couch and thought, oh, I didn't finish the favorite books video, but the sun is going down, as you can tell, and unfortunately I also have the camera kind of like in my light, so it's like really not ideal. But I brought with me a little tree and a little glass of eggnog so that we could be slightly festive as I talk about my favorite books that I don't own. A lot of the books that I really loved, I did purchase a copy, but some of them I haven't yet because I either couldn't find it or I had sales fall through as well. I had 2 sales fall through. One was for Strange Interlude, which was a favorite, and the other was for Flying, which is more of like a guilty pleasure and less of a favorite. Strange Interlude is a really long play. It's like 6 hours by Eugene O'Neill, and it is about this woman named Nina, some of her family and her friends and romantic interests that are around her, and it really explores use of inner monologues. And one of the reasons why I found this a favorite, the writing is really lovely. The topic exploration and the vibe were also just really in tune with me at that time. I really resonated with Nina in certain ways. I just thought she was a wonderful character. One of the most interesting characters that I've read this year. I'm gonna light this candle again. Even if this is gonna make the lighting weird, it's just nice to have like a little flicker around and like a little freshening of the air. If any candle manufacturers out there want me to be their shill, hit me up. Especially if it's not soy candles. I'm allergic to soy, so. When I was taking my nap, I swear I had an ant crawling on my face and it woke me up. Did I tell you about the absolute ant infestation in my little free library? I had to evacuate an entire colony of ants, and they were really inside one of my books that I have out in the little free library. It's one of the Isabel Allende books, and I had to open up the book like in the sunlight to get the ants to move out. It was nasty. I just want to shout this out real quick. Pearl by the Gawain poet is so beautiful and magical, and it is heartbreaking, the topic. It's about this man. Also, it's like Middle English, super weird, super old. This man, he's in the woods. He's like, it's all moss covered and like magical feeling, and he's looking for a pearl. Then he goes into a dream sequence, and there's this beautifully, like, instead of gilded, she's like bepearled, covered in pearls, all white figure comes and greets him, and it's revealed basically that he was mourning his 2-year-old daughter who died, and this is the spiritual being of his daughter, and she's just there to assure him that she's safe in like the kingdom of heaven. And it killed me. It hurt me. I also don't own Fryin, which is definitely my favorite manga for this year. I've gone really hard into it. Didn't start reading it until kind of later in the year, but I really, really enjoy it. It is about this elf, and she had been on this really important adventure with this adventuring party, kind of like D&D world. She has impressive magical abilities, but also because she's an elf, she has this really long lifespan, and she sees her whole adventuring party die. So she kind of picks up who they have been training, and she takes them with her as her new adventuring party, and she is kind of venturing to complete what her original adventuring party did not fully complete. And I love it so much. It scratches the itch of like Breath of the Wild. It's really beautiful. Glow Rushes was a favorite. Glow Rushes is a children's middle grade novel by Roberto Pumini, and it is about this sickly boy who can't go outside, who has been shut up in this house his life, and his father decides to hire a painter to paint a mural on the boy's bedroom wall to kind of bring the outside in. And this boy's really well read, and he has explored and traveled so much through books and encyclopedias, and the painter and him decide to paint the world on his walls, and it is so beautiful. I really loved this work, and I would love to own it. I just haven't gotten to the point of like trying to buy this book, but it was beautiful. Olympia! Olympia is kind of a weird favorite because there's some problematic like plot content. So I guess I would look up trigger warnings if that's possible for this work. It's old. It's an old play, I think 1920s, and it's originally by Ferenc Molnar, and it was translated by Sidney Howard. I'll read my review that I wrote. I usually don't write reviews for things that aren't something that I get from NetGalley, but it's, I say, problematic in ways you might not expect, horrifying to be honest, but so gripping I couldn't put it down. Princess's quips get me every time. It was like an episode of the Kardashians or something in some weird way. And I haven't finished the reading vlog filming for when I read this play, but you know, I'll put it out eventually. I have to read some slightly heavier work for that video, so it's just not even on my radar right now. I go into all the quips. There's some good ass lines in Olympia. I also read The Hounding by Zenobi Purvis, and in my wrap-up video I convinced myself that this is a 5-star book because it has just stuck with me for far longer than I thought it would. There's these sisters, and they're living in older time England. They're living on the Thames, and they're just kind of weird. They're a little off-putting, and there's a rumor that goes through the town that they can transform into dogs. So it's a lot about like the lack of control over how you're perceived and the danger of being off-putting, the danger of strange men and not doing what they want. Really enjoyed it, and I do recommend it. This comes out next August, so August 2025. So I don't own it, but I would love to. So I should say that was an e-arc provided through the publisher, through NetGalley. Disillusionment by Thomas Mann. The video where I read this is already up, and it's a short story. And it is the short story that inspired the song Is That All There Is by Peggy Lee, which is one of my favorite songs. I love it. And Disillusionment, if you've ever heard the song Is That All There Is, Disillusionment and Is That All There Is are like this. Just about being disillusioned with living and with life. And I love hearing that perspective. It's not shouted off of the rooftops very much. Moon of the Crusted Snow by Wabgishig Rice. I loved this book. This is an apocalyptic or post-apocalyptic tale of this indigenous community in Canada. This is very similar to like media and movies where there is a stronghold in an apocalyptic setting and then there's an outsider. So it does feel very familiar in that way. But I really, really enjoyed this story and how it was told, and also having that indigenous perspective was really cool. And the language, having that language included as well was really cool. That's what I got, which is good because the sun is gone. Please let me know, what were 3 of your favorite books that you read this year? Or if you can decide on your favorite book, let me know your top favorite book. I'd love to hear what everybody loved reading this year. And then I can see if it's something that I would be interested in bringing into my life as well. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed this. If you did, consider sharing this with a friend who you think would also like it. Consider liking and subscribing, and I will be back again soon.